On October 20th, 2011, something unprecedented happened in the modern Middle East. A world leader was captured, paraded in front of cameras, and executed in broad daylight, all while the world watched. But this wasn't some distant historical event from centuries past. This happened during the age of smartphones, the internet, and 24-hour news cycles. A former dictator, once considered one of the most dangerous men in the world, met an end that shocked even seasoned journalists and world leaders. The question that haunted observers then, and still does today, is whether what happened that day was justice, revenge, or something far more complicated. To understand what happened on that October morning, you need to know who Muammar Gaddafi was and how his regime had shaped an entire nation for over 4 decades. Gaddafi came to power in Libya in 1969 through a military coup, overthrowing King Idris I. He was young, just 27 years old, and possessed a revolutionary vision for his country. In those early years, he consolidated power quickly and with an iron fist. His government seized control of the nation's vast oil wealth and began centralizing authority in ways that would define his entire reign. What started as promises of national unity and prosperity gradually transformed into one of the most oppressive regimes the region had ever seen. For 42 years, Gaddafi maintained an absolute grip on Libya. He eliminated political opposition, suppressed freedom of speech, and created a security apparatus so extensive that citizens lived in constant fear of arrest and torture. Entire families disappeared into prisons where many were never heard from again. The regime was known for its brutality, for its sudden arrests in the middle of the night, for its complete disregard for basic human rights. International human rights organizations had documented systematic abuse, extrajudicial executions, and widespread use of state violence against civilians who dared to question the government. By the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s, Gaddafi's government was implicated in terrorist activities across the globe. The bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Scotland in 1988, which killed 270 people, was later traced back to Libyan intelligence agents acting under orders from Tripoli. Gaddafi's regime was designated as a state sponsor of terrorism by the United States and faced international sanctions as a result. This isolated Libya further, driving the economy into decline despite the nation's abundant oil reserves. However, in 2003, something shifted. Gaddafi announced that Libya would abandon its weapons of mass destruction programs and normalize relations with the West. International sanctions were gradually lifted. Foreign investments returned to the country. Gaddafi, who had once been a pariah, began to be welcomed back into the international community. He even visited European capitals and met with world leaders. On the surface, it appeared that the dictator had moderated his behavior, but beneath this veneer of change, the repression continued. The security forces still ruled with brutality. Dissent was still crushed. The regime simply became more sophisticated at hiding its abuses from international observers. By 2010, Libya appeared stable on the international stage, but the country was a powder keg. Young Libyans faced widespread unemployment and had little hope for advancement. Economic opportunities had failed to materialize despite the country's oil wealth. Corruption was rampant, with Gaddafi's family and inner circle enriching themselves while ordinary citizens struggled. Resentment was building beneath the surface, waiting for a spark to ignite it. That spark came from an unexpected place: Tunisia, Libya's western neighbor. In December 2010, a Tunisian street vendor immolated himself in protest against police harassment and economic desperation. His act sparked the Tunisian Revolution, which quickly spread across the region. By January 2011, massive protests erupted in Egypt against President Hosni Mubarak. The Arab Spring, as it would come to be known, was underway, and Libya was next. The first signs of unrest in Libya appeared in mid-February 2011. What began as peaceful demonstrations quickly escalated. On February 15th, protests broke out in the eastern city of Benghazi, Libya's second-largest city. The demonstrators called for political reforms, free elections, and an end to corruption. They demanded accountability for years of government abuse. The Libyan government's response was swift and violent. Security forces opened fire on unarmed protesters, killing dozens. But instead of suppressing the uprising, this brutality only intensified it. Within days, the uprising transformed from a protest movement into an armed rebellion. Soldiers and police officers defected to join the rebels. Military barracks were overrun. Libyan cities fell out of government control one by one. Benghazi became the de facto capital of the rebellion, a liberated zone where a transitional government began to form. However, Gaddafi refused to step aside. From the capital city of Tripoli, he issued defiant statements vowing to crush the uprising. He ordered his remaining loyal forces to attack the rebels with overwhelming force. What might have been a straightforward conflict between government and rebels became internationalized when the Arab League requested international intervention. The United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1973 in March 2011, authorizing military action to protect civilians. NATO forces, led by French and British warplanes, began a bombing campaign against Gaddafi's military infrastructure. This intervention shifted the balance of power dramatically. Without air superiority, Gaddafi's forces began losing ground. The conflict became increasingly brutal. Gaddafi's forces, facing defeat, launched desperate counterattacks. Civilians were caught in the crossfire. Gaddafi's government accused NATO of causing massive civilian casualties, while the rebels accused government forces of atrocities. Reports emerged of extrajudicial executions, torture chambers, and systematic abuse by both sides. The humanitarian situation deteriorated rapidly. Thousands of people fled toward neighboring countries, seeking safety. Throughout 2011, the rebellion consolidated its control over Libya. Major cities fell to rebel forces, though fighting remained fierce in certain areas. Gaddafi's regime, once seemingly invulnerable, was crumbling. However, the dictator remained defiant. He remained in Tripoli, in his heavily fortified compound, refusing to accept that his time was ending. He believed he could still turn the tide. He gave speeches declaring that he would fight to the last man. He said that those who opposed him were tools of foreign powers, that Libya's true people supported him. But these were the words of a man rapidly losing control of reality. As the fall approached, Gaddafi's regime contracted to smaller and smaller areas. His remaining loyalists fought fiercer and fiercer battles, but it was becoming increasingly clear that their cause was lost. The rebel forces, now officially known as the National Transitional Council, controlled most of the country. Tripoli itself was on the verge of falling. Gaddafi's time as Libya's dictator was coming to an end. Though he still didn't fully grasp it, the end, when it came, would be sudden and shockingly violent. By mid-October 2011, Gaddafi was trapped. His compound in Tripoli was under constant threat. Rebel forces were closing in from all directions. His government was in complete disarray. Recognizing that Tripoli was no longer safe, Gaddafi decided to flee his capital. On the morning of October 20th, the day that would become his last, he left his compound for what would be the final journey of his life. Gaddafi attempted to travel north toward his hometown of Sirte, another stronghold where his loyal forces were still fighting. He traveled with an armed convoy consisting of several vehicles, bodyguards, and government officials. Some reports suggest he was trying to escape Libya entirely and reach the border with Tunisia. Others indicate he wanted to reach Sirte to personally rally his remaining supporters. Whatever his intention, he likely believed he could still fight his way to safety. He had survived 42 years in power through cunning, brutality, and determination. He apparently believed these qualities would sustain him now. The convoy set out from Tripoli early in the morning, traveling along a road toward the south. However, the route was not what it once was. NATO jets were still flying overhead, supporting rebel positions. Intelligence networks were actively tracking government movements. The rebels had been waiting for an opportunity like this, a chance to capture the dictator himself. As the convoy traveled, it was spotted by rebel fighters and, critically, by NATO forces conducting a bombing campaign. What happened next became one of the most discussed events of 2011. NATO aircraft, specifically French fighter jets, attacked the convoy. The first strikes targeted the lead vehicles, destroying them and forcing the convoy to scatter. Several vehicles were immediately incinerated. Bodies of military escorts were burned beyond recognition. The attack was devastating and fast. Gaddafi's convoy was completely disorganized in the immediate aftermath. Vehicles that survived the initial strike turned around and fled, trying to escape in any direction away from the bombing. In the chaos, Gaddafi and a small group of his security detail attempted to flee on foot, taking cover in a drainage culvert near the town of Sirte. This was an ironic end for a man who had built his entire regime around control and order. He was now hiding like a fugitive in a ditch. However, the location of his position was quickly discovered. Rebel fighters, acting on intelligence about unusual activity in the area, moved to the culvert. What happened in that drainage pipe would become the subject of intense international debate. The rebel fighters surrounded the culvert and eventually pulled Gaddafi out of hiding. He emerged with his personal bodyguard and a few remaining government officials. He was reportedly confused, disheveled, and unable to grasp what was happening to him. According to various accounts, he asked the rebels who they were. When they identified themselves as opposition fighters, Gaddafi apparently tried to reason with them or appeal to their mercy. But events were moving far beyond negotiation. What happened next exists in the historical record, but it remains deeply controversial. The captured Gaddafi was placed on the hood of a vehicle and paraded through the streets of Sirte. Images of this moment spread around the world almost immediately. There was the former dictator, who had ruled an entire nation for over 4 decades, now at the mercy of his former subjects. He was bloodied, humiliated, and clearly terrified. The psychological reversal was complete. The man who had ordered the torture and execution of thousands was now the one facing an unknown fate in the hands of his enemies. Rebel fighters struck him repeatedly as he was being transported. They taunted him, made threats, demanded he recognize the revolution that had overthrown him. Gaddafi, who had always maintained an image of authority and control, was now powerless. He was held prisoner in the moments that followed, though the exact details of this period remain unclear. Different accounts from different eyewitnesses describe events differently. What is clear is that Gaddafi was in rebel hands, and the international community was watching to see what would happen next. The National Transitional Council, the rebel government that was about to take control of Libya, was faced with a massive decision. They had captured the deposed dictator. They could choose to hand him over to international authorities, specifically to the International Criminal Court, which had already issued an arrest warrant for him on charges of crimes against humanity. This would have meant a formal trial, international justice, and a chance for the world to understand the full scope of his regime's crimes in a court of law. Or they could handle him in another way. Various world leaders made statements. Some called for international justice. Others remained conspicuously silent, perhaps recognizing the emotions running high in Libya and the momentum for immediate justice rather than delayed international processes. The timeline of what happened next is contested, but the outcome is not. Within hours of his capture, Gaddafi was executed by his captors. He was shot to death, though the exact circumstances remain disputed and controversial. Video footage emerged, recorded by rebels on their mobile phones, showing the moments before his death. This footage was broadcast on international news networks, making Libya's deposed dictator one of the first national leaders to be executed in the age of viral video. The images were shocking and graphic. They showed a terrified man, defiant but clearly doomed in his final moments. International observers were divided. Some saw a moment of justice, the oppressor finally facing consequences. Others saw a disturbing act of extrajudicial execution that fell short of the rule of law. The medical cause of his death remains disputed, with various reports describing different injuries and circumstances. Gaddafi's body was later displayed by rebel fighters in the town of Misrata. Photographs showed him clearly deceased, though his final moments were left to the interpretation of observers based on the conflicting accounts and video footage that had emerged. His son Muammar was also killed in the same general area, apparently shot to death under similar circumstances. The symbolism was complete. The dynasty that had ruled Libya was finished. The regime that had terrorized the country for 42 years had ended, not with a formal government transition or international intervention to restore order, but with violence that mirrored the violence the regime itself had used for decades. The reaction around the world was immediate and deeply polarized. In Libya, there was jubilation in many streets. People celebrated what they saw as liberation from tyranny. Some danced in the streets, fired weapons into the air in celebration, and declared that justice had finally come for the victims of the regime. To many Libyans who had suffered under Gaddafi's rule, his death represented an ending of decades of fear and repression. It represented the possibility of a new Libya, one where their voices might finally matter. However, in international diplomatic circles, the response was far more complicated. Human rights organizations expressed serious concerns about whether extrajudicial execution, killing a prisoner outside of a legal proceeding, was appropriate, regardless of the crimes the prisoner had committed. The International Criminal Court had issued an arrest warrant for Gaddafi for crimes against humanity. An international trial would have been an opportunity to formally document his regime's abuses and provide justice for the victims in an official capacity. Various governments made cautious statements. Some expressed concern about the manner of his death, while others simply avoided commenting on specific details. African nations, many of which had complex relationships with Gaddafi and his regime, had mixed reactions. Arab nations similarly divided in their responses. The United States, which had initially supported NATO's intervention to protect civilians, found itself in a position of having to address questions about what had happened and whether it represented appropriate justice or vigilantism. The manner of Gaddafi's death became a symbol of broader questions about how post-conflict justice should function in the modern world. Libya was not the first case of a deposed dictator meeting a violent end. History is full of such moments, but it was one of the first such moments to be extensively documented on video, broadcast globally in real time, and debated internationally by experts and ordinary people simultaneously. The images were powerful and disturbing. The debate about their meaning was equally complex. What became clear in the weeks and months following his death was that Libya's transition would be far more difficult than many had initially hoped. Without Gaddafi, the country faced the massive challenge of building functioning institutions where none had existed for decades. The various rebel groups that had united against Gaddafi did not necessarily agree on what should come next. Regional divisions, tribal loyalties, and ideological differences that had been suppressed under the dictatorship now began to emerge. The question of how to establish justice for the regime's crimes, independent of whatever had happened to Gaddafi himself, remained unresolved. International observers also raised concerns about the fate of other political prisoners and detainees. What happened to government officials and military officers who were captured during the Civil War? Were they treated in accordance with international law, or did extrajudicial executions extend beyond Gaddafi? Reports suggested that numerous individuals faced summary justice at the hands of rebels seeking revenge. The cycle of violence and counter-violence that had characterized the Civil War did not simply end when Gaddafi died. In many ways, his death was a punctuation mark on a chapter of Libyan history, but not the resolution to all the conflicts and tensions that existed in the country. To understand what happened to Gaddafi and why it mattered, you also need to understand the historical context. Gaddafi did not emerge from nothing. He was a product of the geopolitical conflicts of the Cold War, the anti-colonial movements of Africa, and the oil politics of the Middle East. When he came to power in 1969, he positioned himself as a revolutionary figure, opposed to Western imperialism and fighting for Arab nationalism and socialism. These positions found support among many Libyans and throughout the Arab world. However, over the decades, Gaddafi's regime became defined not by any genuine commitment to these ideals, but by the consolidation of personal power. The revolutionary rhetoric remained, but it became increasingly hollow as the regime became more repressive and more isolated internationally. His vision of Libya became one controlled entirely by his will, his personality, and his whims. Dissent was not tolerated. Loyalty was demanded. Those who questioned his leadership disappeared. What made Gaddafi's case particularly interesting to historians and political scientists was how completely his rule was personified. The regime was not characterized by stable institutions or clear succession plans. It was characterized entirely by Gaddafi's control. His children held positions of power. His family members accumulated vast wealth. His security forces reported directly to him. When he finally fell, there were no functioning institutions to take over. there was only a vacuum. The Arab Spring that toppled Gaddafi was part of a broader movement across the region. Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Yemen, and Bahrain all experienced major uprisings during this period. However, the outcomes varied dramatically. Some led to negotiated transitions of power. Some led to new authoritarian governments replacing old ones. Libya's case was unique because of the level of international intervention, the complete collapse of state institutions, and the manner in which the dictator himself met his end. Gaddafi's death also occurred in a specific historical moment. It was before the rise of Islamic extremist groups like ISIS, which would later destabilize Libya further. It was before Syria's civil war became a proxy war between major powers. It was a moment of possibility in the Middle East, a moment when regional uprisings seemed to offer the possibility of real change. However, the reality proved far more complex. Libya's descent into civil conflict and instability in the years following 2011 complicated the narrative about whether his overthrow had truly been beneficial. The central question that remains unresolved is whether what happened to Gaddafi represents justice or something else. Those who saw him as a brutal dictator who deserved to die would argue that extrajudicial execution was appropriate for a man who had killed so many and shown so little regard for human life. There's a rough poetic justice in the idea that he faced a fate similar to those he had victimized. He had ordered executions without trial. He had orchestrated the disappearance of countless individuals. He had shown no mercy to those he deemed enemies of his regime. From this perspective, his own violent death at the hands of those he had oppressed was a fitting conclusion to his life. Those who believe in international law and formal judicial processes would argue that his death prevented a full accounting of his regime's crimes in a court of law. An international trial could have presented extensive evidence of the regime's systematic abuse of prisoners, its torture practices, its extrajudicial executions, and its crimes against specific groups. Victims' families would have had an opportunity to present their cases in a formal legal setting. The regime's crimes would have been documented not just in the historical record, but in legal proceedings that established formal precedent. Such a trial would have been a historical record, a formal acknowledgement of everything the regime did. It would have provided a framework for understanding the full scope of the regime's criminality, and potentially created mechanisms for reparations and compensation to victims. The specific details of what happened to Gaddafi in those final hours remain contested and debated. Various eyewitness accounts describe different sequences of events. Some reports suggest he was killed immediately upon capture. Others suggest a brief period of captivity before his execution. Some accounts describe resistance in combat. Others describe a more passive prisoner being executed. The lack of clarity about exactly what happened creates a troubling historical record. In a formal trial, there would have been opportunities to cross-examine witnesses, to establish facts, to create an official account. Instead, what exists is a collection of conflicting narratives, video footage of disputed quality, and journalistic accounts based on second-hand sources. The International Criminal Court had charged Gaddafi with crimes against humanity. An international trial could have presented comprehensive evidence about specific crimes committed by the regime. Prosecutors could have presented documentation of torture centers where prisoners were held. They could have called witnesses to testify about specific abuses. They could have presented evidence about the regime's systematic campaigns against specific ethnic groups. They could have detailed the mechanics of how the regime operated, how orders flowed from leadership to security forces, how decisions were made about which individuals to target. Such a trial would have created an official, formal record of the regime's crimes that future generations could study and learn from. However, those who lived through the regime's brutality often saw things differently. To them, Gaddafi was not some abstract figure deserving of an abstract legal process. He was the man responsible for killing their family members, for imprisoning their friends, for creating the terror under which they had lived. He was the face of the oppression they had endured. To many Libyans, his death was the appropriate end to his reign, and the manner of that death, while brutal, was not necessarily something they found objectionable. They had lived through brutal governance. They had seen brutal suppression of dissent. They had experienced the brutality that Gaddafi's regime imposed on anyone who challenged it. From their perspective, his end was a form of justice. even if it was not the kind of justice that international law professors would prefer. Justice and revenge, after all, are not always the same thing, but the distinction can feel meaningless to those who have suffered. A person who has lost family members to a regime's violence might not see much difference between formal legal proceedings that imprison a dictator and vigilante justice that ends his life. Both could be understood as responses to overwhelming crimes. The question of which is more appropriate depends largely on one's perspective and values regarding law, order, and the nature of justice itself. The broader historical question is what Gaddafi's fall meant for Libya and for the region. His death did not lead to the creation of a stable democracy or to a peaceful transition to good governance. Libya descended into civil conflict, with various groups competing for power and territory. The security vacuum left by his departure created space for extremist groups to operate and expand their influence. The country's oil infrastructure was damaged in the fighting, reducing the nation's economic output. The economy collapsed under the strain of civil conflict and the loss of state capacity. Hundreds of thousands of Libyans became displaced from their homes, fleeing the violence. Hundreds of thousands more became internally displaced within the country, living in overcrowded camps or makeshift shelters. By some measures, the country became less stable and less safe after his death than it had been under his rule, even though his rule had been oppressive and brutal. Under Gaddafi, there was order, however tyrannical. After his fall, there was chaos. Schools closed. Hospitals lacked supplies and staff. Economic activity ground to a halt. Criminal gangs operated with relative impunity in areas where government authority had collapsed. Kidnapping, robbery, and other violent crimes increased dramatically. For a significant portion of the Libyan population, the period following Gaddafi's death brought not liberation, but a new form of suffering. The suffering of living in a state that had effectively ceased to function. This paradox, that the overthrow of a dictator did not lead to greater freedom but to greater chaos, became a defining feature of the post-2011 period in much of the Middle East. It raises fundamental questions about the nature of revolutions, about how to build functioning societies after the collapse of authoritarian rule, and about the role of external powers in supporting such transitions. These are questions that historians, political scientists, and policymakers continue to grapple with years after Gaddafi's death. They are questions that inform current debates about intervention in other conflicts and about how the international community should approach the problem of authoritarian governance. Was Libya better off without Gaddafi? The answer to that question depends on the time frame being examined, the specific metrics being used, and the individual whose perspective is being considered. A Libyan dissident who was imprisoned under Gaddafi's rule might say yes, liberation from fear is worth the chaos that followed. A Libyan who experienced increased violence and economic suffering after 2011 might say no, the stability of the dictatorship was preferable to the anarchy that followed. There is no single correct answer to this question. Instead, there are multiple perspectives, each with their own validity based on the lived experiences of different individuals in Libya. One of the most significant aspects of Gaddafi's regime was the extent to which it was a family affair. His children were not simply private citizens enjoying the fruits of their father's power. They were active participants in the governance of Libya and in the accumulation of vast wealth during his reign. Understanding what happened to his family after his death provides important context for understanding the events of October 20th, 2011. Gaddafi had several children with his wife, Safia Farkash. Among his sons, Muattasim Billah had been particularly prominent. In 2011, Muattasim served as a military commander and played an active role in directing his father's military response to the uprising. When the convoys fled toward Sirte, Muattasim was with his father. Like Gaddafi, he was captured and executed on the same day, in the same general location. His death occurred under similar circumstances and raised similar questions about extrajudicial execution and the treatment of captured prisoners. Another son, Saif al-Islam, was also a prominent figure in the regime. He had positioned himself as a more reformist voice, giving interviews to international media in which he suggested that the regime was modernizing. However, he was also implicated in security operations and in the suppression of dissent. When Libya fell to the rebels, Saif al-Islam escaped Libya and fled to neighboring Niger. He was eventually captured in 2011 and held in a Libyan prison. His case became controversial because his imprisonment was not recognized by the international community for months, and there were concerns about his treatment and the legality of his detention. He would eventually be released years later, and the Libyan government would announce his death in 2021, though the circumstances remained unclear. Other children also held positions of power or influence. Saadi, another son, was a military officer who had been involved in suppressing the uprising. He also fled Libya in 2011 and escaped to neighboring countries. He spent years living in exile before eventually returning to Libya. The daughters of Gaddafi largely remained out of the public eye, though they were also beneficiaries of their father's wealth and power. The broader question that Gaddafi's family raised was one about dynastic rule in the modern Middle East. Was Gaddafi planning to pass power to his sons, creating a hereditary dictatorship? Evidence suggests that this was indeed a possibility. His children held military positions, security roles, and business interests that suggested they were being groomed to maintain the family's rule after their father. If Libya had not undergone revolution in 2011, it's entirely possible that a son would have eventually inherited control of the regime. This would have been a continuation of the pattern seen in other Arab regimes, where dictators or authoritarian leaders attempted to establish family dynasties. The fact that Gaddafi's family was scattered and that various members faced capture or exile added another layer of complexity to the events of October 20th. It was not simply the end of one man's rule, but potentially the end of a family dynasty. This made the events more final in some ways, and more traumatic in others, for the remaining members of the family who escaped Libya and spent years living in exile, hoping either for eventual return or for a new life elsewhere. One of the most remarkable aspects of Gaddafi's death was the way it was documented and broadcast to the world. Unlike previous dictators who had been overthrown and executed, Gaddafi's final moments were captured on multiple personal mobile devices by rebels and other witnesses. These videos were uploaded to the internet and broadcast on news networks around the globe within hours of the events occurring. This created an unprecedented situation where a world leader's death was experienced in real time by the international audience. The distribution of these videos raised complicated questions about media ethics, the nature of modern warfare, and the role of technology in contemporary conflicts. News organizations had to make editorial decisions about whether and how to broadcast footage that showed graphic violence. Some networks chose to show limited portions of the footage. Other networks declined to show any of it, while still others showed extensive portions of the video. These editorial decisions reflected different judgments about the newsworthiness of the images versus the ethical concerns about broadcasting graphic violence. The existence of mobile phone video footage also meant that historical facts about exactly what happened could potentially be established more clearly than would have been possible without such documentation. However, the quality and reliability of this amateur footage was also limited. The videos were often brief, shot from limited angles, and did not necessarily capture complete sequences of events. Interpretations of what the videos showed varied. Some observers viewing the same footage reached different conclusions about what had occurred. In previous eras, when such events were filtered through official government channels or through journalists with limited access to information, there would have been far more opportunity for competing narratives to persist without clear resolution. In the mobile phone era, where information and images spread immediately and globally, there was both more transparency and more opportunity for confusion and misinterpretation. The images existed, but their meaning remained contested. This democratization of documentation also meant that rebel combatants could publicize their successes in ways that would not have been possible in previous conflicts. Within hours of Gaddafi's capture and death, videos celebrating the moment were circulating on social media platforms. These same platforms allowed coordination among rebel groups, spread propaganda, and created a narrative of the conflict in real time. The media environment in which Gaddafi's fall occurred was fundamentally different from previous authoritarian collapses, and this difference shaped how the events were perceived and understood globally. Muammar Gaddafi's execution on October 20th, 2011, marked the end of an era in Libya and a moment of profound global historical significance. The images of his capture and death became symbols of the Arab Spring's power to challenge entrenched authoritarian rule that had seemed immovable just months earlier. They also became symbols of the dangers of extrajudicial violence and the challenges of post-conflict justice in the modern world. For the international community, his death raised difficult questions about intervention, justice, and the rule of law. For Libyans, his death represented both liberation and uncertainty about what would come next. The man who had built a regime around the total control of Libya met his end without formal trial, without conviction in court, without the traditional apparatus of justice that modern nations claim to value. Whether this was appropriate justice or a failure of international law remains a matter of debate. What is beyond debate is that his 42-year rule over Libya had come to an end, and the country faced the immense challenge of building something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. The death of Gaddafi was not the end of Libya's struggles, but rather the beginning of a new chapter filled with its own conflicts and complications. The promised democracy did not materialize quickly. The stability that Libyans hoped would follow the dictator's departure did not arrive. Instead, the country fractured, and various groups competed for power in an increasingly chaotic environment. Yet Gaddafi's execution remains one of the most significant moments of the 21st century, a moment when a world leader met his end in a way that shocked the global conscience and raised questions that remain profoundly relevant today about justice, intervention, revolution, and the future of the Middle East. As modern nations continue to grapple with questions about how to respond to authoritarian regimes and how to support transitions to democracy, the lessons, both positive and cautionary, from Libya's experience in 2011 continue to inform policy discussions and historical analysis around the globe. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.